On a return flight from Chicago to Dallas, Lamar Hunt began planning the formation of a new football league. With the NFL's rising popularity in the late 50s, more people wanted a piece of the pie, but the NFL was hesitant to expand.
There's no excuse for expansion in the National Football League. Expansion can only weaken the personnel.
This led to the formation of the AFL, a competitor league. But before it could even begin, the NFL poached Minnesota, whose team was originally set to play in the AFL. That left them scrambling for a replacement. Eventually they landed on Oakland. But given Oakland was a second choice, they had no stadium, and they had to bounce between different locations until the Oakland Coliseum was built in 1966. The Oakland Seniors, who quickly changed their name to the Oakland Raiders, had a dismal start. In their first 3 years, they had a combined record of 9-33 with an average attendance of 11,000. That's going to put financial stress on any team, and they ended up losing $500,000. But the AFL couldn't afford to drop to 7 teams, so Buffalo came to the rescue. Ralph Wilson, the Bills' owner, gave $400,000 to the struggling franchise. Money wasn't going to help turn this team around, but it bought them some time. In 1963, they made a bold move by hiring Al Davis, a San Diego assistant coach, and was then the youngest person to ever be named head coach and general manager of a football team. By the way, if you're new here, welcome. This is NFL Unveiled, and if you like old school, tough football, you're in the right place, because that's all we talk about, and we upload every Saturday at 1 PM Eastern. So the Oakland Raiders went 1-13 in 1962, and Al Davis executed the greatest turnaround for a team at the time, leading them to a 10-4 record in 1963. That would earn him AFL Coach of the Year. To pull off such a quick turnaround required a different mentality. Al Davis took inspiration from baseball to build the future identity of the Raiders. From the New York Yankees, he took size, power, and intimidation. That was reflected in the menacing defensive units the Raiders would have over the years.
Winning Super Bowls is based on power and physicalness. Within the first 5 plays of the game, the other team's quarterback must go down, and he must go down hard.
From the Dodgers, he took speed, and that strategy would thrive in the AFL, who often favoured passing over the run-heavy NFL, largely due to Davis's influence. He used what he called the vertical game.
When we came out of the huddle, we weren't looking for first downs. We didn't want to move the chains. We wanted touchdowns.
Less of the ground and pound and more big plays. The Raiders became a reflection of the man Davis was, a renegade, a guy who didn't follow a lot of the social norms. It's not an overstatement to say Davis was a visionary. He recruited the first black quarterback at USC, he drafted a quarterback in the first round, which had not been done before, he hired the first Hispanic head coach, the first black head coach, and the first female CEO in the NFL. But it wasn't just his progressive attitude, it was his eye for talent, and that's something he really developed as a coach. At a time when NFL teams shared player evaluations for the draft, he had his own staff grade college players. He drafted players like Gene Upshaw from historically black colleges, which were often overlooked at the time. He also found players that fit into his system perfectly. No one embodied the vertical game better than the Mad Bomber. In John Facenda's own words, LaMonica's arm whipped and the ball whistled. With a rocket arm like that, the Raiders could stretch the field with ease. And throughout the years, Davis would continue to find players that were underutilized by the rest of the league and somehow rejuvenate their career. He didn't care about a player's race, their politics, or personal habits, as long as they helped.
Just win, baby.
Take Warren Wells, who was cut by 2 teams before showing up to the Raiders, and then went on to dominate, averaging 26 yards per reception in 1969. Or even Lyle Elzado, who was thought to be done in the league after 11 years, and saw his career reinvigorated, winning Comeback Player of the Year in his first season with the Raiders. Even George Blanda, who was cut by several teams for being too old, but then retired with the Raiders as the #1 scorer. Davis loved the underdog, and that's why he took all these so-called rejects.
And we're talking afterwards, he goes, I root for ESPN, you know why? And we were in business 4 years maybe. Because you're the underdog.
Yep.
Just like that, because I root for the underdog. And if there was a fight to have, Al would lead it.
So he assembled an inventory of NFL outcasts, and that created this close bond between the players. Nobody else wanted them except the Raiders, and that really built this us versus them mentality.
I don't know what the Packers had, I don't know what any other team had, but the Raiders got it, and I think we'll always have it. That's a family, and that's what we got with the Raiders.
Now everybody loves an underdog story, but the Raiders weren't the most popular outside of their fan base. They developed a bit of a reputation. The physical defensive play was seen as dirty by many.
Some of the guys cheated. Some of the guys kicked and bit and hit you in the back, and some of that kind of stuff. Hit you in the back of the head, and it's on film.
no unit embodied the Raiders' defense better than the Soul Patrol of the 70s. Willie Brown, Skip Thomas, George Atkinson, and Jack Tatum. In Fran Tarkenton's own words, Atkinson and Tatum and the rest of the gang were so physical and strong that I'd have to wait and hope my guys could get open before I got killed. Dr. Death, the Assassin, those are nicknames that tell you all you need to know about this defense. But just as Davis was building this powerhouse, he was called to serve as the AFL commissioner, leaving the Raiders without their visionary leader. The thing is, the Raiders were owned by a group of investors, and Davis couldn't execute on his vision with competing interests. So he devised a hostile takeover of the franchise when one of the owners was out of town. He teamed up with another owner to oust Wayne Valley. And with Davis in control, he could shape the team on his terms. He'd select John Rock as the Raiders' next coach. And that year, the Raiders went 13-1, won the AFL Championship, and LaMonica won AFL MVP. But the Raiders lost in Super Bowl II against the Packers, and came up short in the playoffs the following year. John Rock also got frustrated with Davis, who was pretty involved in the day-to-day of running the team, so he resigned. That left Davis with a decision to make, and not one to follow the beaten path. He took a risk, hiring the then youngest coach ever, John Madden. While Madden went on to win 100 games, faster than any coach in NFL history, and he led the team to 10 winning seasons and 7 division titles in 10 years. Even more important than the winning was that, like Davis, Madden embodied the Raider way.
I only had 3 rules, and to be on time, like we're going to have a meeting or everyone's on time and do that, and to pay attention, listen when you're speaking, because if you're going to teach, you have to listen, and then play like hell when I tell you to. Play like hell on Sunday.
Under Madden, the Raiders won a lot. They had the highest win percentage of any team from 1963 to 1975. But in a loaded AFC, they just couldn't get over the hump and reach the Super Bowl. Take 1972. The Raiders found themselves in the AFC divisional round against the Steelers. Whether they liked it or not, and they definitely didn't like it, this game was going down in the history books. After a 30-yard run by Ken Stabler, the Raiders took a 7-6 lead in an otherwise defensive slugfest. The key moment in this game came on 4th down with 23 seconds left. In these final moments, the Immaculate Reception, or as Raiders fans would call it, the Immaculate Deception, the Steelers would score on a controversial walk-off touchdown. But in spite of such a devastating loss, the Raiders were undeterred. The Immaculate Reception basically sparked a decade of dominance for the Steelers, and it could have sent the Raiders in the opposite direction. The Raiders would continue to win, but struggle in the playoffs, but they'd get their best shot in 1976. In the final game of the regular season, they faced the Bengals. So if the Bengals win, they make the playoffs, and the Steelers miss the playoffs. If the Bengals lose, the Steelers were in. And the Steelers had beat the Raiders in 1974 and 1975 in the AFC Championship game, and then went on to win both Super Bowls. So many probably thought the Raiders should just let the Bengals win, and they get an easier path to the Super Bowl. But even though the Raiders lost 2 straight years, they wanted revenge. That being said, this is the 1976 Steelers, which had one of the best defensive seasons in NFL history. They held teams to less than 10 points per game, which included 5 shutouts. The Raiders would beat the Bengals and face the Steelers in the AFC Championship, and there were no shutouts on this day. The Raiders controlled the game. And even though they went on to win the Super Bowl, beating the Steelers seemed to be the highlight of this season.
And I just go in there and I show him this ring, and I show him the score on the side of this ring. Al Davis put 24-7. Raiders 24, Steelers 7 on the ring. That's how much we hated the Steelers.
The following year, in 1977, the Raiders should have had back-to-back Super Bowl appearances. After a double overtime thriller in the infamous goes to the post game against the Colts, the Raiders headed to Mile High Stadium. Now this call was almost as controversial as the Immaculate Reception. Down 7-3 late in the third quarter, they made a goal line stand and forced a fumble. But the refs blew the call. It wasn't ruled a fumble, and the Raiders went on to lose. The Broncos scored on that drive, and despite 14 fourth quarter points by the Raiders, they lost 20-17. John Madden would retire following the 1978 season, and that left Davis with the challenge of finding another great coach. He hired Tom Flores, the team's receiver coach, and the first Hispanic coach in NFL history. The early results were mixed. 9-7 his first season, missing the playoffs, and then going into 1980, they started 2-3, and they lost their starting quarterback Dan Pastorini, who broke his leg. Enter Jim Plunkett, the most unlikely of heroes. Up until this point, he was a total bust. He went first overall in 1971 and didn't have a good career with the Patriots, and his short stint in San Francisco didn't go any better. But this is the Raiders, the place where you go to save your career. Plunkett rattled off 9 wins to just 2 losses. The season that initially looked lost was turned around in large part thanks to Plunkett. Defensive star Lester Hayes also led the league with 13 interceptions and added 5 more in the postseason. The Raiders became the first team to make it to the Super Bowl and win it, with Plunkett's 3 touchdowns getting him Super Bowl MVP as the Raiders cruised to a 27-10 victory against the Eagles. The Raiders had re-established themselves as a powerhouse. Fast forward a few more years, entering the 1983 Super Bowl. This Raiders team looked even better than the 1980 roster. Marcus Allen had been drafted in 1982 and emerged as a star. But the Redskins also looked good. They had scored a then record 541 points in the regular season. But on this day, the Redskins couldn't even get 10 points on the board. The Raiders' decade plus of dominance included 12 division championships, the 1967 AFL championship, and 3 Super Bowl victories. That would make them the only team to play in a Super Bowl in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Based on that 1983 season, you would expect this team to continue to be relevant for years to come. But behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to form. It really started earlier that year during the 1983 draft. Firstly, John Elway should have been a Raider, but the NFL blocked the trade. That being said, the Raiders could have recovered if they didn't select Don Mosbar. That's because another quarterback would be drafted with the very next pick, Dan Marino. And according to Dan Marino's agent, Al Davis was distracted, largely due to his ongoing legal battle with the NFL to allow the Raiders to move to LA. But given the Raiders went on to win a Super Bowl, it seemed possible to overcome. Teams miss on players in the draft all the time, and they did have Marcus Allen. But Al Davis's relentless pursuit of control and personal vendettas began to take a toll on the franchise. He even created problems in his own locker room. It had to be Al Davis's way, if not, you were out. And while that attitude did help him build the Raiders to what it was now going to be part of their downfall. Given the rule changes that came in the 70s, the passing game began to explode. And despite the emergence of the West Coast offense, Davis did not adapt. And this is a guy who completely innovated the passing game years prior. He restricted coaches' attempts to modernize the Raiders' offense, and it didn't help they had an aging Jim Plunkett, and his replacement, Mark Wilson, was not a worthy replacement.
Now, Bill Walsh tried to take it sideline to sideline and change the game dramatically in the 80s, where it was more tactics and more timing. And it really wasn't about just filling up with just pure athletes. It was about finding that right combination of speed and intellect and other kinds of things, where I think that the game changed there and changed for the Raiders. And so for many years, the Raiders were behind as the West Coast offense took shape.
The offense would continue to lean on Marcus Allen, who did excel, leading the league in rushing and winning MVP in 1985, but that led to a slight problem. Marcus Allen's popularity began to soar, and arguably eclipsed the Raiders. That definitely bothered Al Davis. It was no longer just the Raiders, it was Marcus Allen and the Raiders. That's when it seemed to become personal, and the brilliant mind that built the Raiders shifted from just win baby to I must win baby. Marcus Allen was pushed to the side in favor of Bo Jackson, but with his injuries, Bo didn't last long, and Allen would eventually leave to a division rival, the Chiefs, and continue to play well. So by the late 80s, early 90s, the Raiders were kinda mediocre. Things did seem to turn around, after they returned to Oakland in 1995, when Davis hired a young John Gruden. He seemed to revitalize the team. And in fairness, in line with the Raider philosophy, they found another player rejected by the rest of the league in journeyman quarterback Rich Gannon. With the addition of Jerry Rice in 2001, who paired nicely with Tim Brown, the Raiders were rolling. It had been almost 20 years since the Raiders won 2 or more consecutive seasons with double-digit wins. But after a brutal loss in the divisional round against the Patriots, in the infamous tuck rule game, Davis seemed to use that as an excuse to change things when in reality it was more personal between him and Gruden. So he traded Gruden to the Bucs. And initially that seemed to work out. Rich Gannon won MVP in 2002, and the Raiders went to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, they would face their former coach. And Raiders coach Brian Callahan, for whatever reason, abruptly changed the game plan a couple days before the game, and also did not change any of the audibles. So that meant John Gruden knew the audibles being used, taught his players, which just led to a humiliating loss. The elephant in the room at this point was age. Rich Gannon was 37, their number one running back was 30, star receivers Tim Brown and Jerry Rice were 36 and 40 respectively. On defense, Rod Woodson was 37, Bill Romanowski 36, just to name a few. So injuries to these older guys and just poor play led to a 4-12 season in 2003. And within a couple years, most of the Super Bowl roster was gone. In reality, the Raiders needed to rebuild, but Al Davis tried to stick band-aids on a massive wound. He signed aging players with massive signing bonuses who produced little. Drafting also no longer seemed to be a strong suit. His obsession with strong-arm quarterbacks, speed at skill positions, and massive linemen didn't work out, as his draft picks kept missing. So inevitably, with this poor roster construction, the stability they once had with coaches, just 2 from 1969 to 1987, was no longer the case. From 1988 to 2011, the Raiders had 11 head coaches, and following the Super Bowl loss, they went on a 7-year stretch of 11 losses or more each season, the longest in NFL history. 16 Raiders have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. This is one of the most storied franchises in the history of the sport, and even though many would hope they return to relevancy in the not too distant future, it seems like a while away. The man who built up this team also brought it down, but the legacy of Al Davis and the Raiders remains undeniable. A team that, at its peak, redefined football with its defiant culture, groundbreaking strategies, and larger-than-life personalities.